You will also have heard of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I think in Vietnamese it's called KOOS, and a convention. And it is the thing that we've read about in the newspapers last year, also the years before, where so many leaders of the government, of governments of many countries of the world have gathered last year in Copenhagen. I was there, I met your Prime Minister there, and he was there with a very large number of Vietnamese officials, more than any other Vietnamese Prime Minister ever attending any such summit. And if that's true for Vietnam, it was also true for China, for the Americans, for every other country in the world. So it was completely crazy. There were 40,000 people registered to enter a center that had a capacity of 15,000 people. So how, that doesn't add up. So people had to be excluded. One minister was excluded, not from Vietnam, but from China, and that became a diplomatic problem. So an incredibly large gathering, the largest ever in the world of global leaders. And in that Conference of Parties, or COP15 in December last year, they managed some sort of agreement, but not the expected agreement, to save the world, according to many, needs more political will. We can look at the history of greenhouse gases a long way back, many years back, and what we see through the century, particularly the 20th century, suddenly a very major increase. So completely unhistorically much carbon dioxide in the air, and it stays there for quite a while. We can see the temperature rising roughly around the same time. And we can understand where these CO2 emissions were taking place. They were taking place mostly in the developed world, in Europe, United States, also Japan, Australia, and a few other countries. Next, please. Now here you see a picture which is very difficult for you to follow, I guess, but important to realize is that per person, the emissions of greenhouse gases are extremely variable. So here you see the United States. One person in the United States per year produces so much carbon dioxide, more than 20 tons per year. Here you see Ethiopia. One Ethiopian produces 0.1 ton of carbon dioxide per year. So the cause of the problem is in the United States and other rich countries, and not in Ethiopia or Tanzania or Bangladesh or other poor countries. Here is Vietnam. Vietnam is rising fast. Because of economic growth, because of more electricity, more motorbikes, more Lexus cars, and more of everything. Anybody with a Lexus car in this room? Not yet. It will be soon. Next, please. This is a little bit too complicated for you to see here, but these are scientific projections. What do we need to do in order to ensure that global warming is not going to be too bad? What do we need to do to make sure that global warming would stay roughly below 2 degrees Celsius annually, which means carbon dioxide must stay below that thick line? So what do we need to do to take this curve? Well, so far the scientific projections are we will never manage that curve unless we do a lot more to reduce greenhouse gases compared to what we are doing. Here are scenarios of production of greenhouse gas in the whole world over the next century or so. And these scenarios are these lines. Here you see the numbers. And that means that if the world is really working very, very hard, according to what we now know technically and financially, we still will not manage to get here, except if we take what is called a sustainable emissions pathway. Now, in Copenhagen last year, the agreements of big countries, including developing countries like China and India and Brazil, were not nearly enough for getting to that sustainable pathway. I will talk to you a little bit about what would be the dangers, or how big would be those dangers if we do not manage to get to a very much bigger reduction in greenhouse gases. Now first, who are the victims? Who are suffering from climate change? Of course, poor countries more than others. Small island states that will be flooded by sea level rise and disappear completely off the map are obviously victims. Low countries, including parts of Vietnam where there are deltas with large numbers of people affected by sea level rise, but also drought and flooding. And in Vietnam, in the Mekong Delta, for example, saline water intrusion into the estuaries, so that the irrigation water is salty and they can't use it anymore. Of course, the poor people suffer more than the rich, because the rich can build a high house and they are safe from flooding, or they go somewhere else, or they buy land in Hoa Binh or somewhere. So they can escape, but the poor can't do that. So there is a huge difference in how resilient we are, what we can do about the risks of climate change. And of course, schools and clinics are vulnerable, and later on in the presentation I'll show you some solutions for that kind of vulnerability. Particularly important in Vietnam at this stage of development is that industries are vulnerable and cities are vulnerable. Hanoi, I think I live in Hanoi for about 10 years now. It may have doubled in size in the past 10 years. Where there was rice and I was cycling through the rice fields, now there are skyscrapers being built. And that's just 10 years. Now, you should ask yourself the question, are we expanding the cities and building the industries in areas that are free from flooding, that are going to be capable of being supplied with water? And the answer is, not quite true. In Ho Chi Minh City in particular, the city continues to expand in areas that are totally unsustainable because of climate change. So major changes are required in decisions as to where we expand to. I'm using the word vulnerability here, and if you do not know this word, you must try to understand it, because for climate change people, this is perhaps one of the 3 or 4 most important words. Vulnerability means something like, you know, what might happen unless you have lots of capacities. So again, compare a rich and a poor person. The rich person builds a high house with 3 or 4 stories, the poor person not. Flood comes, the poor person can only sit on the roof. The rich person simply goes to the 2nd or 3rd floor. So this is the same flood, but there is a difference in capacity. So there is a difference in vulnerability. Now, many times you hear in the press in Vietnam, Vietnam is the 5th most vulnerable country to climate change. And as a UN official and policy advisor, I'm saying to every minister, every official, every scientist, please stop saying that. It's not true. It's not true. Vietnam is not the 5th. It's not even in the top 50. Vietnam is vulnerable, sure, but there are at least 60 countries more vulnerable than Vietnam. Some will totally disappear. Don't you think that they are more vulnerable than Vietnam? Vietnam has capacities. Vietnam is not as poor as many other countries in Africa or some other countries in Asia. So because Vietnam has capacities, it should not call itself vulnerable. It should call itself at risk. Vietnam is at risk, sure, it's low. But Vietnam has educated people. In Vietnam, more than 90%, more than 95% of the population can read and write. That's not true in many other countries. The country has money because it is growing so fast. So capacities need to be part of the equation. Nevertheless, the vulnerabilities or the risks exist everywhere, and some are more vulnerable than others. So I want to talk a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions mitigation. And as I have already said, I want to talk to you about why do we need sustainable emissions, that 7th scenario. And that is in order to prevent what people call dangerous climate change. So climate change is already happening. Whatever we do with emissions, I can guarantee you that climate change will happen for more than your lives, for more than your children's lives. It will continue for at least a century or a century and a half, even if we stop emitting all greenhouse gases today, as a globe, as a world community, which is totally not realistic. So, in other words, the damage has already been done. Now, the question is not to stop climate change. The question is to avoid dangerous climate change, to make it not too bad, to ensure that global average warming will be no more than 2 degrees Celsius, or maybe less even than 2 degrees Celsius. So what is dangerous climate change? It is that the weather fluctuates more extreme. One of you asked me the question. In 2008, on the 31st of October, there was a very, very serious rainfall in Hanoi and Hadong and in this part of Vietnam. Exceptionally wet. The whole city was flooded. Some people died, in fact. Many people suffered. Everybody got wet. Why? Because it is very strange to have heavy rain on the 31st of October. Is that climate change? And the answer is no. We cannot say that that rainfall on that day is because of climate change. It's impossible to say. We can only say, statistically, more of that kind of event will happen because of climate change. We cannot say, in 2012, on the 1st of November, there will be another heavy rainfall. No, no, no. We can't say that. Certainly, we can't say that that would happen because of climate change. We can say, in your lifetime, even in my lifetime, there will be many more of similarly extreme and unexpected events. And it may be the other way. It may be the heavy rain combined with a deep drought in the same year, at a different part of the year. And this is almost certain. And the question of dangerous climate change is to not make those fluctuations too bad, not make them completely wild, make them twice as bad as what happened on the 31st of October in 2008. And this is what the scientists currently think can be avoided if we below 2 degrees Celsius. But even that, they do not wish to say with any certainty. They say it's 50% chance. That means it's also a 50% chance that we fail to avoid it, even with those 2 degrees. Now, all of that means that rich countries, but also large countries in the developing world, must cut emissions as soon as possible. It means that China should stop increasing greenhouse gas emissions ASAP, as soon as possible. Vietnam should think about reducing within a few years instead of continuing to increase. And with all the rest of the world, take some responsibility. This is despite the fact that Vietnam is not guilty to the problem that we already have. It is simply a fact that also Vietnam will suffer from the results, so we better play part of the solution. In a place like Vietnam, there is a major increase in demand for electricity. And so what we would be promoting is that rich countries must fund Vietnamese industry at a much higher level to start building windmills, to start building renewable energy production facilities, and stop building coal-burning facilities. And there is also a major possibility for limiting greenhouse gas emissions growth by increasing efficiencies. So that means in Vietnam, every university, every house, except for some very few new houses, have very bad insulation. This room does not have air conditioners, I see, only fans. But many rooms with air conditioners have doors and windows of this nature. It means it is extremely difficult to cool the room. It means that it is inefficient in energy use. And therefore, construction of any building in Vietnam can improve with very little cost, but with very major returns on energy efficiency. This includes my own house in Hanoi. It was built not with any energy efficiency in mind.